Welcome to my channel. I'm Elizabeth, Liz Muschett, and today the Astrology Star Sisters are going to talk about the 2025 Venus Star Point in Aries. My star sister, guest, and friend is Marcia Butchart. Welcome, Marcia.
Hi, everybody. Let's
It's
see,
good
it's
to
a
have you
good
back.
afternoon where we are.
Yes, it's good to have you back, and spring is finally here, and it's like there's all this activity happening in spring. We have eclipses, and we had the spring equinox and the Venus star point. It's busy, busy, busy.
Yes, it is, and all these impending sign changes for major outer planets.
Okay, so I'm gonna so for to get a hold of Marcia, it's Madam M at mindspring.com. And my website is alightpath.com, and we enjoy hearing from you. And I'm going to turn it over to Marcia. Thank you, Marcia.
Okay, yes, the Venus star point in the sign of Aries. This actually happened on the 22nd and 23rd, depending what time zone you lived in. Okay, here in the US, it was on the 22nd, but just hopping over a few time zones into Europe, it was the 23rd. So this is kind of review. I did a lecture on the Venus star point in Gemini last year. So just to refresh and bring people who are new up to date about what we're talking about here. The Venus star point is the exact degree and minute of a Sun-Venus conjunction, which in the old Arabic and medieval literature is called the Cazimi. This is a concept of Ariel Gutman. She invented this concept of the Venus star point, studying rather than the apparent heliacal rise of Venus as other scholars like Adam Gainsberg are doing in their Venus research. She is treating the exact moment of the conjunction as a distinct beginning. Now, the Cazimi being important for a planet has very old roots, because it was said that when a planet was too near the sun to be seen, it was said to be combust, burned up, or under the beams if it was just in the process of disappearing. And this was supposed to weaken the planet's ability to manifest its effects openly, visibly, for itself alone. It is under the thumb of the sun, literally. Maybe not so much burned up as sort of like blinded by the light. You aren't going to see a planet when it is too near the sun. But the Cazimi, the point where it gets right in the same degree as the sun, is a strengthening factor for the planet. It's like, I heard it described in an old WSAA lecture years ago, that the process of, I think it was by Adam Ellenbos, who said that it is the process of becoming combust is the planet going into a furnace and having all of its impurities burned away. And when it is in exact union with the sun, it is pure. It is truly reborn.
I like that. And just to clarify, the WSAA is the Washington State Astrology Association, for those that are unfamiliar.
Yes,
And
I'm a member.
I am too. And I just wanted to clarify that the last Venus star point was a direct motion, and this one's a retrograde motion. And I'm sure you're going to get into that later, but I just wanted to make sure
Oh, yes.
that we say that.
So Gutman treats both a retrograde, which is, she calls it the morning star conjunction, and the direct evening star Cazimis as equally important. Because, as she points out, Venus, as a goddess and as an archetype, has a dual nature. She also associates her concept of the Venus star point with the life force desire of Eros, not just erotic in the meaning of amorous and sexy, but the drive to live. This is what Freud meant by Eros when he pointed out that there were two opposing drives, apparently, in his viewpoint, in the human psyche. One was the striving to live, and the other wanted to die. He called them Eros and Thanatos, life versus death, literally.
That's very Good information. I like that.
Yeah. And, so it's sort of like, okay, the dual nature that of Aphrodite and the god and the planet Venus, who Jean Shinoda Bolen calls the alchemical goddess. Okay. Um, the lists that I have here are Gutman's kind of slightly abridged list of Gutman's associations with the morning star manifestation of Venus and evening star. The morning star Venus, born at the retrograde conjunction with the sun, um, was called Lucifer, the light bearer. Rises before the dawn, before the sun comes up. You can see her in the morning sky really late at night, if you happen to be up at 4 in the morning. She is at perigee, which is the fancy astronomical term for the closest that a planet gets to Earth. She's retrograde and therefore is moving fairly slowly in terms of zodiacal motion. But in terms of visual motion along the horizon, she rises very swiftly in the sky after she appears. And then it takes months for her to slowly descend down back into another conjunction with the sun. Because of this apparent contradiction of that she's moving slow but rises swiftly in the sky is because she and the sun are moving in opposite directions. Of course, he's always in direct motion and here she is going backward. So she reappears only 6 to 8 days after the conjunction with the sun when she is retrograde. So Gutman says that she calls her Aphrodite Pandemos, for the people, for everybody, and argues that this is the goddess of raw sensuality, who likes the good life and the good stuff. And I will advance the notion too that under the Pandemos Venus, pleasure is sacred. Pleasure is considered extremely evil by a lot of monotheistic religions. And even people who are not religious, but who believe that if you're going to actually become a real thinking, conscious, spiritually and intellectually evolved person, you have to say goodbye to the body. But Aphrodite Pandemos says, "Thus think that because thou art virtuous, there shall be no more cakes and ale." She also tends to have more of a warlike, or me first persona, much more yang in energy than an evening star Venus, which is in direct motion and more closely aligned with yin. And she is also considered by Gutman more earthly and therefore aligned with the sign Taurus, one of the signs that Venus rules, as opposed to her Libra association. Now, there are two myths about her birth, and they're both lawless. Okay, Aphrodite is not a goddess who was born from a sanctified marriage. They are illicit liaisons, both of them. But one is more of the usual kind of like Zeus saw, a mortal he desired, and yum, good, and managed to seduce her, and Aphrodite was born as a result. Whereas in the celestial Venus, she is the daughter of Titans, of Gaia and Uranus, the sky god, and only is born from the sea foam after good old Saturn, who's helping out his mama get out from under the thumb of her abusive husband, castrates him, and throws his genitals into the ocean. And the union of the ocean waters, the divine waters, with the divine sperm from heaven gives birth to Aphrodite. So both are lawless, but one is more sensually oriented and the other is rather violent, which I find an interesting dichotomy, that the celestial Venus should be the one with the less friendly birth. Okay,
Ready for the next slide?
Yep. Unless we have any questions coming in through, comment.
No, if I get questions, I'll ask you. Thank you.
Good. And just remind me to ask you every so often. Now, the pattern of Sun, Venus, Cazimis through the zodiac makes this beautiful 5-petaled flower. And this graphic on the right side of the slide is a picture of 250 years of Sun-Venus conjunctions, both direct and retrograde. So the Venus star points move backward by about 2 degrees between conjunctions. So they go there. They do not stay in the same place in a sign. So a Venus star point in any given sign remains in that sign for roughly 100 years, some less, some more, and then is absent from that sign for about the next 150. So a Venus star point takes about 250 years to go through the zodiac. And I invite people to note how closely this mirrors Pluto's 248-year journey around the zodiac. They happen about, within a few years of each other. A Venus star point return to the exact sign and degree of that sign where she was, at one point. This has, I'll just toss this out as an interesting factor to add into the mix of people making political speculations and wondering what's going to happen, especially in the United States and the world order, because there were people who use, for instance, in the birth chart of the United States, they use the, July, some version of the July 4th, 1776 chart, and say, okay, we've had our Pluto return because Pluto now has left Capricorn where it was when it was 1776. And if you look at when the US government actually started functioning and began its operations in its current form, Pluto was at 15 to 18 degrees Aquarius. We have not yet had our Pluto return by that. And we're coming up on our Venus star point return because let me just make sure I have this here. Yeah. So we had, when the Constitution was ratified, there was the first legislative session held, the first election was ratified, George Washington was inaugurated, and the first Supreme Court session was convened. That all happened within, roughly from September of 1788 through February of 1790. And different dates, different charts for each of those things, but they all had the same Venus star point, which was at 16 Leo. So in the 2030s, we will come up on our Venus star point return as a country.
That's an interesting concept to add in those other charts to look at, because that would give a lot more information.
Yeah, it probably would. Okay, shall we go back to the slides then? So here's just one Venus star point. Before you saw the beautiful colored graphic with all the Venus star points there could ever be. Here's just the one, our current one, where the Venus star point is in Aries. So a Venus star point repeats in a sign once every 4 years, but they alternate between the retrograde and direct Cazimis. So this one that we're having this year is retrograde. The one that we will have 4 years hence will be a direct Cazimi. Venus will be in direct motion. So you get that pretty pentagram that is formed by successive retrograde or direct Cazimis that happen every 8 years. So it's sort of interesting to look at that. Can you go back to that just a moment? There's something I'd like to point out. You'll see in the graphic on the right that, and this comes straight out of Ariel Gutman's Venus Star Rising. I think it's page 153. Anyway, those shaded areas are the signs that are involved in the other 4 points of the star. The darkest one, okay, over on the lower left is Aries. And then the other that are involved when the patterns started out, they were first in the sign Aquarius, in Scorpio, in Cancer, and in let's see, reading Virgo. Okay, so they shift backwards as well, and those shaded areas are the areas of the signs that the star will slowly shift backwards throughout the entire Aries era. Okay, now we can go. So the cyclic patterns are kind of interesting. Timing. Successive Cazimis are about 9 months, about a human gestational period, apart. And as mentioned before, they move backwards through the signs. So they alternate between retrograde, direct, and so forth. So each year's VSP can be used as a hot degree in mundane forecasting. And it's interesting to look at world figures who have natal placements near that degree. Public figures, celebrities, politicians, etc. We will do that towards the end of this presentation. Now, a shift from one sign to another evokes a new era. We're in an Aries era right now. It will eventually move backwards into Pisces. And so this is something that people are a bit anxious about, since you realize that the point is moving backwards, and this year's Venus star point is at 2 degrees and change of Aries. Okay, this is getting awfully close to the world axis, the 0 Aries point, as the symmetrical and Uranian astrologers like to call it. So, yes, these are, as the Chinese curse would say, interesting times. Okay. So there's evolution within the VSP era, because only 5 zodiac signs make up any era's star. And there are VSP sign shifts that occur within an era. So everyone alive today, who was born after April 20th, 1929, and there are some people who were born before that, who were in the Taurus era, if you were born after April 20th, you probably have Aries as a sign in your personal star. So what are your others? So in between 1929 and 1964, the signs were Aries, Scorpio, Cancer, Aquarius, and Virgo. After June 1964, the Cancer shifted backwards into Gemini. And then the arrangement was Aries, Scorpio, Gemini, Aquarius, Virgo. After January 1986, Aquarius shifted backwards into Capricorn. And after August 1987, only, a little over a year later, the Virgo shifted backwards into Leo. The next big shift that happened just 3 years ago, this fall, was the shift backwards from Scorpio into Libra. It's interesting, someone pointed out that in most of the era, Mars-ruled signs kind of held the reins. Mars and, especially with Gemini and Aquarius, Mars and Mercury. And, oh yes, and with Virgo, then the sun came in when as a major force, but now, we got Mars, Saturn, with Aquarius and Capricorn. Saturn's been there kind of all along, plotting. And now we've got Venus starting to come back into the picture, which Ariel thinks is extremely important, because now a sign that is ruled by Venus will be part of the Venus star, which I think is kind of cool myself.
I like that too. That's great. Are you ready for the next slide?
Yeah. So here's the natal chart for the Venus star point of this year that happened a few days ago, at 2 degrees and 29 minutes of Aries. Now, I've cast this chart for what I call the world axis. 0 prime meridian, just like Greenwich, but at the equator instead of in the city of Greenwich. Because while there are factors, a lot of factors, this whole chart will be rotated and turned around, obviously, depending on where in the world you are when it takes place. So, all right. But here is something that is going to be valid the world over, even if it's only as a subtle undertone. So, as I've said before, this is a morning star or retrograde Venus star point. And this particular Venus star point at 2 and change of Aries is active. You can see a little purple circle down there that circles Venus and Venus and the Sun. Is active until January 6th in 2026. Now let's add a few more factors. I wanted to address just for a moment the notion that, okay, there are a lot of sources, and certainly this was what I learned when I first began studying Venus cycles. They argued that the retrograde Cazimi is the beginning, the equivalent to the new moon of a Venus cycle. And so the direct Cazimi only marks a new phase in that overall cycle, like the full moon. Even though we just had a lunar eclipse and it was considered very important, everybody's panting now about the upcoming solar eclipse, when it will be a conjunction of the sun and moon. Hold on just a moment. I need to look over here. I forgot to put my water.
Oh, that's important.
Any place close.
Stay hydrated.
Yeah, stay hydrated, especially since I'm doing all the talking. I've added one more circle in this chart and that is around the planet Mars in Cancer, because that is the sign ruler, of course, of Aries. And in Hellenistic thought, the ruler of the sign, and here I'm referencing a lot of Demetra George's work, the ruler of the sign is like the owner of the estate. And so if there are any tenants in his sign, they are his guests, and he is supposed to provide for them. And so Mars in Cancer is kind of like a just molted crab. He's lost his shell and his hard protection. And, this is when, and it's almost here too, soft shell crabbing season on the East Coast. And what they do is they wait for them to be, to just have molted, and then they go snatch, and then you enjoy them as dinner. So
that's good.
Poor crab.
Yeah.
So this is not a host who perhaps can provide a lot of stuff for his guests, is it?
I wouldn't
he's
think
too busy
so.
hiding, trying to make sure he stays alive.
Defending himself.
Defending himself. Whereas the sun in Aries, okay, is in his exaltation sign, and he's also in his own triplicity, fire, the Lord of Fire. And so he has a lot more power over the Venus star point conjunctions in Aries than the sign ruler does. If you were doing one of those medieval astrology dignity charts, the sun would end up with more dignity points than Mars does.
Yeah, that's a good point to point out, because it adds more flavor and more information to the Venus star point.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like I have heard people say in the current political situation we find ourselves in the US, where is the fight? There should be more open, fighting and, sort of like saying, hey, this is not right. Mars is disadvantaged here. Mars is still trying to make sure he survives.
Exactly.
Now, this is an interesting thing that I like to pursue, because the Cazimi zone, which is the Arabic and medieval term, is the time window when Venus is within 17 minutes of her exact conjunction with the sun on either side of it, this itty-bitty slice of time. And this zone is brief at morning star conjunctions, since the sun and Venus are moving in opposite directions, zodiacally speaking. So Venus moved into the zone on March 22nd at 8:45 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, which would have been about 1:45 here on the West Coast. So we got into the zone, early in the afternoon a few days ago, and then finally left at 5:30 the next morning. That's not a lot of time. When I looked at the Venus star point, examining the direct Venus star point that happened in Gemini of last year, it was much longer. Now, Hellenistic thought said that the planet is in the heart, in the sun's heart, when it occupies the same whole degree as the sun. So Venus's first entry into the heart was even earlier, but still on March 22nd, about 9 hours earlier, and last exit from the heart then, the next evening. Not long. It was like 3 or 4 days, as I recall, when we did the Gemini broadcast, wasn't it, Liz?
Oh, yes, it was. It took a while. It seemed like, wow, this is a couple, 3 days period, and this one's pretty short.
Yes, it is pretty short. This was why everybody was so excited when they got to see the actual Venus transit across the sun back in 2012.
Oh,
And
yeah, that
yeah,
was
it was
amazing.
done and gone in half an hour, like an eclipse.
Right, that was amazing. I watched it online because they had
Yeah,
really
I
good
did too.
footage of it. Yeah.
So I love this graphic that comes from Ariel's book, The Venus Star Point, and You, I call it. Your personal prenatal Venus star point is the head point that's marked with the numeral 1. Okay? And then the next retrograde conjunction, because we're talking about the retrograde conjunctions here, so that up there at the number 1, that's where Aries is this time around. So then the next conjunction down at the number 2, the left foot, will be in one of the other signs, then over to the right foot, then over to the left hand, number 3, 4 is the right hand, and finally 5 is the left foot. So you've got 4 other points that form your personal star, but the head is the one that sort of leads them off. The others all help out in their own way, but the head is the one that leads them off. So Aries has been one of the points in a star. For instance, my personal head star is in the sign of Scorpio. And so my where the Venus star point is for me this time around is in my left foot. And this then, this is considered very important because that star point that happened, before will feed energy to the next one. And then the next one in turn feeds energy down. And let's see, your Venus star point, your head star, Liz, if we go back for just a moment.
Sure, is Cancer.
Is Cancer.
And I'm not sure which one is Aries. I don't remember offhand.
We'll have to plot this out for people. Hey, that's a thing we can offer folks who are listening. Hey, you want to find out your hands and feet of your, and in addition to the head of your personal star?
Yes, I have it
Okay.
written down. I just don't have it memorized.
So this particular morning star Venus star point, who may feel it most? So people who have planets or chart points near the cardinal axis, near 2 Aries, 2 Libra, or 2 Cancer and 2 Capricorn. And, those, especially people with the sun, their birth is near one of the equinoxes and the solstices. So I'm talking a fairly narrow orb here, not the monster 10-degree thing. Okay. And then there's a second class of people who may notice this if your natal Venus star point is the head of your personal star, and it's a retrograde conjunction. And I wrote down here all of the dates that I pulled from Ariel's book where the Venus star point is a retrograde morning star conjunction in Aries. So if you were born, for instance, between the 18th of April in 1937 through the 2nd, until the 3rd of February, in 1938, you've got Aries as your Venus star point, the head of your star. The same thing for people born in late March, 27th of March 2009, until the 11th of January 2010. Because each star point is that degree, that important prenatal degree for someone born within that time window. So let's think about the vernal equinox, where all this is happening. Yes, only the beginning. People love to have beautiful pictures of flowers, when the vernal equinox shows up. Oh, spring is coming. The just hatched chick is much more like what spring coming actually feels like. That chick has had to use its head, literally, to peck its way out of its shell. That's Aries for you, and has had to give birth to itself. And its feathers are all nasty and wet, and, the poor thing is sitting there looking around going, okay, now I'm here. Where have I gotten to? But like the crab molting, the shell was too small, had to come out. And another manifestation that's distinctly more Venusian, I think, are butterflies when they hatch from the chrysalis. Because this is the sex time, the Venusian time of that insect's life. The adult form, where the whole thing that they're doing pretty much is mating and producing the next generation of eggs. And not only are they mating with, others of their kind, they're also pollinating all the flowers that they're drawing nectar from.
They're helping each other out. I like that.
They're helping each other out, but these birth moments, this is why the world points, especially the equinoxes, can be considered so treacherous, where they feel it's a very uncertain time. You can be rejoicing, for instance, over the seeds and everything that you have germinated for your crop this year, and you get a good killing frost, and there go your seedlings, and you have to start over.
Well, it's like yesterday we had thunder and lightning and not
We did
super
too.
strong winds, but winds and heavy rain. So it's like, okay, it was really warm a few days ago, and then all of a sudden it's cool and windy and it's changing. It's like, well, spring's not quite here. We were just teasing.
Fooled you. So yes, with the Venus star point at this vulnerable period of the year, do you stay safe or do you rush right in? The photo on the left, I'm sure you all recognize from the countless times you have flown and the flight attendants display, putting your mask on. And this is good advice. Put your mask on first. This was something that was brought up in a lovely little podcast I listened to just yesterday by Kelly Surtees, whose work I very much appreciate. And she said, with Venus retrograde in Aries, it is time to make sure that you are taking proper care of yourself and what's going to help you. Photo on the right is another of those Aries photos that I just couldn't resist because, okay, yes, at the equinox, what is happening? Breakup. The ice being driven away, and this guy is doing it with his head. Let's see, how many are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? 5. 5 slabs of ice he breaks with his head. Karate master.
Ouch. That looks painful to me, but
It's one of those things that requires lots of planning. This is another thing where the feat itself looks astonishing, but there has been so much planning that went into it. Yes, you're putting your mask on first and making sure that you can do this without breaking your neck.
Exactly. Strategy.
And because of strategy, I thought, what if this time, this particular Venus star point, so near the vernal point, is about the birth of a goddess? So here we go. Zeus, or represented by the planet Jupiter, his first consort, his first wife, was Metis, who was one of the Titanesses, and she was a goddess of wisdom, especially. Well, she was pregnant with a child when an oracle said that her second child would be a son who would supplant Zeus. So, like father, like son. Zeus's father, Kronos, or Saturn, would swallow each of his children when they were born so that they would never supplant him, never succeed him. He would remain king forever. But then Rhea, his then wife, hid Zeus and thwarted the whole plan. And instead of destroying his father in the manner that Kronos had destroyed Uranus, his father, he got Metis, and she was the one who helped counsel him throughout the wars that the gods had with the Olympian gods had with the Titans, which eventually led to Zeus becoming top dog. So Metis is already pregnant when he tricks her into making herself very small. She was a great shapeshifter. And he swallowed her. Well, this was not the end of things, because as she brought her child to term, he developed permanent migraines. So he finally, in desperation, summoned Hephaestus, the god of the forge, to split his skull with a double-edged axe. And Zeus and Metis' daughter Athena sprang forth, full-grown and armored. And more than just a warrior, she was a strategist who had her mother's wisdom. There are certain sort of mythically oriented psychologies I've read which try to characterize Athena as your typical father's daughter, obedient always to what the father wants. But, and they point out that she never had a mother. Well, she never had a father either. She was born an adult. Someone with perhaps the asteroid Pallas, which is associated with the goddess Athena, strong in their chart, was born old before their time. With sort of like a wisdom that is not usually there in, say, a 2-year-old kid. So I think personally that the Athena was probably schooled by her mother while, her mother supposedly was fashioning all her armor for her so that she would be, protected and ready to go out and, kick ass and take names when she was finally born. So the reason that I got off on this track was because I went down the rabbit hole of saying, is each Venus star point within a sign during an era the same as all the others in the same sign? And the answer to me is no. The first question to answer is, where are the rulers of the sign of the Cazimi, which is Aries? All right. So there are constants within an era, and there are change agents. And the Aries morning star Venus star point constants are the Sun, which is in Aries, and Venus, which is in Aries. The Sun in Aries is always exalted, as I'd said when we were looking at the birth chart, and Venus in Aries is always in detriment. Not the easiest position for her. Venus in Aries, as a lecturer said once that I listened to a number of months ago, I thought it was really cute. She said, Venus likes to forge relationships. And Aries is a Mars-ruled sign, is a rather warlike sign. So when Venus gets her, finds herself in Aries, she finds herself in, say, an army training camp. And this is not where she would prefer to be.
Yes, it's hard to make connections when Venus is in Aries, because Venus wants to connect, but Aries doesn't want to connect.
Aries says, you'll do it my way, or, oh, you want to be friends? Let's fight first. And after we have dueled enough and, established our ranking within the pecking order, then we can be friends. Now, the change agents are the location of Mars in the chart, which is Aries' domicile lord, and the location of what are called the bound lords in Aries. I'll get into them more in a minute. Let's look at the Mars factor. Oh yes, that's another thing. Whether it's a day or a night chart, the actual house position of the Cazimi and any alignments with fixed stars, that's location dependent. Now, I've cast that chart for, the world axis, but here it is sort of up close. So Mars is in Cancer, in the sign of his fall, the crab, who's just molted, trying to stay safe. The sun is exalted, yay me, in Aries. The triplicity lords of the conjunction are the three diurnal planets from classical astrology, Jupiter, Sun, and Saturn. The bound lord, if you look down at Aries there, the pink sector of the chart close-up that I have there, you'll see different segments of unequal length, number of degrees, each with a planet inscribed within it. And those are what were called the bounds of the planets. The sun and moon do not rule a bound of a planet because as luminaries, they were said to rule everything, the entire chart. So aspects, there are, of course, the biggie is good old the Cazimi itself, but Mercury is right next door. Mercury has yet to do his own Cazimi he's already done a Cazimi with the sun. Now he is moving away, and eventually he will come back in direct motion to meet up with the sun himself. Then Jupiter, Mars, the sign ruler, squares the conjunction, but only sort of. It's a sign-based square, as they used to call it in Hellenistic astrology, rather than degree-based. It became degree-based when it got within an orb of 3 degrees. And Saturn, is sitting there in Pisces near the eclipse degree, which everybody, was looking at. Oh gosh, Saturn is near the eclipse degree of the, where the sun was in Pisces while the moon was in Virgo. And what about that? And Neptune is sort of right next door too, but they are technically in what the Hellenistic astrologers called aversion. They can't quite see each other. If you take your hands and you move them back here, about to the side, this is a planet in aversion. You really can't see it unless you actually turn your head in that direction or your eyes. And so, when they talk about someone being blindsided, yep. It doesn't have to be from behind. It can be from the side. And you always worry about someone coming up behind you, but from side to side, not so much. The fact that Jupiter makes that nice sort of sign-based sextile is actually kind of cool, because not only is Jupiter the, one of the diurnal and therefore fire and air associated planets, he is also the bound lord. If you look down where you see Jupiter's symbol at the very bottom of the chart, you will see that, Jupiter, the bound ruler, does a sextile to this conjunction. Is there possibly some extra vision and wisdom that can maybe be more easily accessed? They talk about the sextile being the aspect of friendship, sort of minor friendship, with a little help from my friends, maybe. Okay. Now I want to jump, because I was struck by looking at the birth of the VSP era. Again, this is a world axis chart in 1929, and our current Aries Venus star point. So you can see up in the upper left portion of the chart, the one on the inside is the birth chart, 1929. The one on the outside is this year's chart. So obviously, you can see that the conjunctions themselves, those big purple eggs up in the top left, they're in very different places. It started out at 29 and moved backward, and now it's at 2. But Mars is in the same place, in the same sign, and almost in the same degree. Now, there would be people who would be very worried about that, especially considering everything that went down in 1929. But Pluto is nowhere near there anymore. Pluto was right there, within 2 degrees of transiting Mars in 1929. And yes, the underworld sort of came and swallowed a lot of stuff up. Pluto is now, in this year, in Aquarius. Okay, that's, this is different. This is completely different.
That's good.
So while Mars is still disadvantaged in Cancer, he is not taken advantage of by Pluto as directly as he was back then. This is something that I like to point out to people when they're stressing about, like, their Saturn returns. They go, oh my gosh, the last Saturn return I had was like X. Is this going to be more of the same? And nope. Because the other factors in the chart have moved to different places.
Exactly.
So let's consider the Mars factor, okay? The domicile lord of Aries. So his domicile, of course, domiciles are Aries and Scorpio. The signs of his detriment are Libra and Taurus. Exaltation is Capricorn and fall is Cancer. And he rules the old guys back in Greece and then in the Arabic era, gave him water as his main triplicity rulership, especially if you were born at night, which I thought was really interesting. And he's sort of a common ruler of earth signs. He's one of the so-called nocturnal planets. Now, Mars only appears in 4 signs throughout this Aries morning star period, okay? In Cancer, he was there at the birth in 1929, but also in 1961, 1963, and now this year. He's in direct motion, which is good, but he's in the sign of his fall. However, he's also in his own triplicity. In 1937, 69, 2001, and upcoming 2033, he was in Sagittarius, ruled by Jupiter. And while direct, was slowing to near his retrograde station. Because even though this is a trine, the waxing trine between the sun and a planet means that the planet itself is slowing down and getting ready to go retrograde. Then Mars was in Pisces in 1945, 1977, and 2009. And he was direct and in triplicity, but he was also, couldn't see Venus because they were in signs next door to each other. They were in aversion. And then he's in another Venus-associated sign the remaining times, 53, 85, and 2017, where he's direct, definitely direct, but in detriment. However, he is associated by duplicity, and his aversion with Venus is relieved because of a mutual reception. If Venus is in Aries and Mars is in Taurus, this means their energies can mix more effectively. So what about those bounds? I like this quote from Charles Obert, who wrote in 2018, using dignities in astrology, the domicile ruler needs to work through the bound ruler to implement its agenda. Demetra George likens this. She has a wonderful metaphor, I think. that it's like a school where the domicile ruler is the school's principal. They're responsible for administration, seeing that things work out, that resources are allocated, etc. The bound rulers are the individual teachers in your classes. And within that classroom, that teacher's word is the law. And it's, that teacher's practices that will govern how the course and, the success of the students actually proceed. In Dorotheus of Sidon, he gives the bound rulers tremendous power. And so do a couple of the other Greek astrologers from way back, set the Wayback Machine there. They would say, for instance, if the planet is in a sign ruled by a benefic, say Taurus, and also in the bounds of a benefic, good, good, good. If the planet is in the sign of a benefic, Taurus again, let's use that, but in the bounds of a malefic, Mars or Saturn in this case, not so good. It means that you won't get quite the resources that you think you need to do your stuff. If the planet is in the sign of a malefic, say Capricorn, but in the bounds of a benefic, say Venus, it's like, okay, you're in a tough spot, but you've got local help to help you succeed anyway. And the worst case of all, obviously, is if you're in, I have Mars, for instance, in my natal chart, in Aquarius, ruled by Saturn, in Saturn's bounds. And yes, I do have a Mars problem in my life. So I listed the bounds of Aries in reverse order because this is how the Venus star point goes through them throughout the era. From 1929 through the mid to late 40s, the Venus star point was taking place in the bounds of Saturn. Arguably, this was a really hugely difficult era. First, we had the Great Depression. Then we had World War II, and, it was sort of like, oh my God, is this ever going to end? Then in 1953, the morning star conjunctions moved into the bounds of Taurus, ruled by Venus. Okay, it's in the sign of a malefic, but all right, things are looking up. And we're going to, this is sort of like the Cold War era, isn't it, Liz?
Yes,
in the
yes.
US, where you're gearing up for the next fight in order to make sure that you don't have to ever again, supposedly. We'll keep it under wraps here. So then in 1969, okay, the bound switches to Mercury and stays there until the mid 80s, early 90s. So this is a time of a lot of societal turbulence. Mercury is a switch hitter, goes back and forth, can be diurnal or nocturnal, can be, helpful or hurtful, and tends to take on the coloration of whatever sign he's in and planets he's tied to via aspect and rulership. So then the bound of the conjunction moved into the bounds of Venus starting in 1993. And we're there until, sort of through the 2012 conjunction when we were all so excited. These are the morning star conjunctions I'm listing only. I will do evening star conjunctions when that comes around again. And since 2017, the Venus star point has moved into the bounds of Jupiter and will be there, through the last one. It's interesting that the notions of what people wanted freedom for, and our freedom was tremendously curtailed in many ways in the US after 2017. Jupiter was in Libra, which is not a bad thing, but he was retrograde. He was basically opposing the conjunction in Aries. The final one will be in Aquarius. Isn't that interesting? Jupiter will be in one of his air signs of his airy triplicity for each of the Venus star conjunctions that star point conjunctions that he has. Any questions you want to ask, Liz? Just sort of.
No, this is such amazing information. So the Jupiter with the air signs, that would be a trine by sign. So I would
Yeah.
think that that's helpful.
Yep.
Oops. So you ready to go on to the next slide?
Yes. So energetic interplays, sort of this, looking at all of this. Okay, Mars is in Cancer, as we pointed out, near the same degree as in the Aries Venus star point birth chart, but without Pluto. Okay. Jupiter is in Gemini and is the bound ruler of the Venus star point. Jupiter's in detriment in Gemini. You're trying to do keeping track of details can be hard for Jupiter in Gemini.
A lot of
Or
information
having the details multiply all over the place.
Yes.
What do we focus on next? But he's in his own triplicity and he's in Venus's bounds, which brings me to the next point. Jupiter and Venus share a mutual reception by bound. Now, none of the classic literature that I've read so far really goes into mutual reception beyond anything but the sign rulership, domicile rulership. But other ways that I learned it, especially some of the medieval instruction that I received, second and third hand, I don't have any real primary sources that I can rattle off the top of my tongue, but I started considering this mutual reception by bound, or by exaltation, or by, triplicity, as possible helpers that you might be. The bound is considered, by the time we get to the Renaissance era, a minor dignity. It isn't accorded quite the same importance that it was in some of the Hellenistic literature, but, I started looking at something. On January 6, 2021, when the U.S. Capitol was overrun, Mars was the sole bound lord, the final dispositor by bound of every other planet in that chart. As Biden's inauguration approached, people were distinctly worried. They were afraid there would be something like this happening again. But the final dispositor of that chart by bound was Venus. And so there was no monstrous militaristic outbreak. There were poetry readings by, beautiful artisans, this very Venusian stuff. And I was like, okay, I think I'm going to watch these a little more closely, because Jupiter and Venus are also the final dispositors by bound rulership of this particular conjunction. And oh yes, another interesting little factoid, Jupiter at 14 Gemini is conjunct last year's Venus star point that was in Gemini. So somehow that communicative ability that Gemini possesses is, infusing this particular Venus star point. And this was why I thought of Athena's birth. The asteroid Pallas at 11 degrees of Aquarius trines that Jupiter in Gemini fairly closely. It's a degree-based aspect. And Saturn in the 2025 Venus star point chart that everyone is so worried about because it's on that lunar eclipse point, is conjunct Pallas in the Aries era birth chart. And so, yeah. And finally, I had to laugh because I decided to look up online the asteroid Hephaestus, which is conjunct Uranus this year. And, a few days ago, still conjunct Uranus, I'm sure by now. But it is to laugh because it was Hephaestus, the smith god of Olympus, who was brought in to split Zeus's skull in order that his daughter could escape.
Interesting.
And Uranus has that little reputation for unexpected, sudden, interventions and activity. And as a final thing, I decided, the feminine energy, while Venus herself is in detriment in Aries, the feminine energy in the world chart is backed up by a couple of fixed star placements, which I talked a little bit about in our last fixed star podcast, where we were looking at stars on the meridian and the IC. Okay. Diadem, the alpha star in Coma Berenices, is peaking or culminating, to use the more technical language. And we drew little circles there around the MC and also, where Diadem is in the sky. It's interesting that the constellation Virgo is right at the zenith there, that little intersection point of all the lines. That's
yes,
a
I
goddess
can see
from
that.
yesteryear. I saw a bumper sticker years ago that reminds me of this. God is coming, and man, is she pissed. Then, on the other side of the sky, at the world chart, near the star associated with the IC, is Meroc in the constellation Andromeda. I decided to choose rooting as in sinking roots into the ground, as opposed to anti-culminating, which is so clumsy a term that I wish we could come up with something different. So there's my little throwing my hat in the ring for some new terminology.
I like your terminology.
Peaking and rooting, yes. What's up there and what's underfoot. So what about these two stars, Diadem peaking and Meroc rooting? Well, Diadem is in the Coma Berenices, and the myth about her is actually partly historical. Berenice was a queen of Egypt, the consort of Ptolemy III, I think. This is under Alexandrian rule, after the Greeks have basically established sort of a rule of their own and put their own people on the thrones and everything in Egypt. So supposedly, to celebrate her husband's safe return from war, she sacrificed her hair, cut it all off, and laid it in the temple of Aphrodite. So that's the sort of official, and so Diadem is considered a rather gentle star, the sacrifice of love. Or is it the tuft at the tip of the lion's tail, which was what Claudius Ptolemy called the Coma Berenices? You do know that the lionesses do most of the hunting in the pride, don't you?
Yes, I
Yes,
am aware of that.
yes. And if you've ever seen cats getting ready to pounce, you can see their tails start to twitch. The lionesses also do team hunting. A single lioness who is hunting by herself only has about a 30% success rate of making a good kill. But if there are two or three, or more, the success rate shoots up to close to 90%. Now, the other star, Meroc, in the loins of Andromeda, who was the chained princess, okay? She's the princess of what Bernadette Brady likes to call the stellar royal family that surrounds the North Pole. You have, in addition to the great and small bear that, have the, guardianship of the pole, and Draco, the dragon that winds around it, you then have Cassiopeia, the queen, Cepheus, the king, Perseus, the prince, and Andromeda, the princess. The Greek myth, of course, is that Cassiopeia was punished. They sent the gods. I forget what she was. It was some sort of hubris thing, but they said that they would have to sacrifice their daughter and leave her to be eaten by the sea monster that was ravaging the shores of their kingdom. And so they chained her and left her to her fate. And Perseus, who had just finished slaying Medusa, was just happening along there and pulled out Medusa's head and turned the sea monster to stone, and Andromeda became his queen. So Brady thinks of the stars in Andromeda and the constellation itself. It's sort of the power of receptivity and creation and being able to creatively use all input, which is held by other authors too to be a rather female skill. But here's the other thing. I've seen other interpretations of the constellation Andromeda, which is these two lines that sort of stars that kind of spray out from the great square of the constellation of Pegasus, the winged horse. So is Andromeda more about the blood of Medusa that gave birth to Pegasus? Here's another violent act that resulted in a miraculous birth. Because as Perseus cut off the head of the Gorgon, the blood that fountained from her severed neck hit the earth, and there came Pegasus, full grown, and flying. Perseus was not the one to tame him. That was Bellerophon later on. But this, sort of like, okay, out of a violent act that was definitely anti-woman, this tremendous symbol of freedom burst forth.
Yeah, it's interesting how there's different myths about people being born as adults, not children.
Yeah. Or born with gifts, prodigal gifts that, if you think of Mozart, I used his chart in one of our fixed star conversations a while back, and I will probably go back to him for our next one.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So yeah, the idea of feminine energy always being gentle is maybe not the whole story.
Yeah, there's always two sides to a story usually, and sometimes more.
And sometimes more. I think of this in particular regarding the concept of gender fluidity. I mean, I'm definitely cis, and I was born that way, and I'm a woman, and I feel like a woman. But what about the people who, are of two minds, and the whole complexity, chromosomal complexity of human gender is much more fluid than most people give it credit for. If you dig just down a little bit, and I was fortunate to have a friend back in previous years who was an obstetrician, and she told me about all the different chromosomal variations that there can be between male and female. And, deciding what sex you are at birth is not the simple matter that people have imagined it is.
Yes, I've heard some stories to that way of thinking too, that there's differences.
But there's also, in terms of that, okay, that concept, of being whole people,
Mm-hmm.
that, women can be both, giving, nurturing, and everything, and extremely potent. And men can be, both powerful and commanding and everything, and also, be feelingful.
Yes, very much. So you ready to go on to the next slide?
Yes, because I promised I would talk about this. What I was looking for when I looked at public figures was searching for the rule of three, as we like to call it in astrology, that to be assured of impact, okay, something should be indicated in a chart or astrologically in three different ways. So I went, okay, who has natal factors near the Aries Libra axis? And, you know, that's what factor one. Do they have an Aries Venus star point? That's factor two. Um, and is that a morning star? That would be factor three. But here are two people who've been very prominent in the news in the US of late: Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, who've been really burning up the airwaves with their rallies, going to the American people and saying, you know, okay, what is it you want? Tell, if your legislators and your Congress people won't listen to you, tell us. We'll make sure they know. And they've really been burning it up, haven't they? So I find it very provocative that these people, okay, who have, yes, let me get my special little list out here. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, her moon is at 3 degrees Aries. And it opposes Mercury at 2 degrees of Libra. So here is the voice, who can speak for the needs of the people. In any mundane chart, I don't know if you remember this, but I remember learning in Karen Wennerland's little study groups that in mundane charts, the moon represents the common people.
Yes.
And good old Bernie Sanders, he has his Mercury at 2 degrees of Libra. So they, even, with decades of age difference and everything, they are speaking right now with one voice and saying, Libra, this is not fair. We're asking the question, is this fair? What do you guys think? Then I got interested. Okay. Who had natal factors near 2 degrees of the Aries Libra axis? I went looking specifically in American history around the founding fathers. George Washington had Saturn at 2 degrees of Aries. And this was he was alive during an era when the Venus star point was part of the whole, star that was being drawn in the sky. The second guy over on the right is Samuel Adams, one of the other founding fathers and, another president of the US, and he has his son at 4 degrees of Libra. So, yes, this is channeling energy that was there in the founding figures of our country. Here is another interesting one who hit all three qualifications for. She has natal factors near 2 cardinal axis and an Aries star point, and that is a morning star point, retrograde. And that is Mette Frederiksen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, who is saying, no thank you very much to the notion of the challenge that has been thrown out. Oh, Greenland should be part of the United States. The Greenlanders don't like the idea either. So her natal Jupiter is at 5 Cancer. That's about 3 degrees away from the, exact square to the Venus star point. And her natal Venus star point is at 16 Aries. Which I find extremely interesting because this directly opposes Donald Trump's Jupiter at 17 Libra.
That is very interesting.
I'm going to be watching her to
Yeah,
see
that'll
how
be
this
something
all
to
plays out.
watch.
Yeah. So in the middle of all of this, you go, all right, well, this is all a huge heap of information and it's all very interesting, but what happens with it?
Exactly.
Now is the time to call up your inner Athena. Okay. Um, I have a good handle on her myself because I was born with the asteroid Pallas conjunct my Mercury. And so maybe in your life, if you have Pallas especially conjunct any natal personal planets, you may have an Athena story in there. And here's mine. I was in college, in music school, and one of my good friends and I were both flutists, and she got a chance, a real plum of chance, to go into a special study program out of state. And she was dating, unfortunately, she had terrible taste in men, poor thing, and she was dating a guy who was also a musician. Um, he was in the service and playing in the uh, military bands and such like that. And so they ran across each other at professional gigs occasionally. So while he talked her into lending him her car while she would be gone for that summer. And I said, "Oh dear, can't you tell him no? Tell him your mother won't let you or something, anything." And she said, "I could, but he'll only just talk me around again." And suddenly, I don't know exactly where this came from, but it might have been because I was spending a lot of time in close association with my future father-in-law, who was very much a strategist. I'll have to look up where Pallas is in his chart because I suddenly got an idea. Her day job, since we were musicians, of course we had day jobs. Her day job was at a bank. She was a teller. And so I created a little contract thing, 3 lines on a piece of paper that said from date X to date Y, this person, undersigned, fill in the blank, has total legal and financial responsibility for this car, license plate X, VIN number Y, and, here are the signatures. And I said, see if he'll sign it. I fully expected him to, you know, totally refuse, but he didn't. He patted her on the head and said, sure, anything for you, babe. So they went to the bank and, had the document signed and notarized. She went off to her wonderful study program for the summer and she had her car. And she came back in September and the car was a wreck with all kinds of body dings and some, you know, it had needed an oil change that wasn't done. And so she just sighed and quietly set about having it repaired. She'd been back 2 months and got the summons from traffic court to come and answer 7 parking violations and 3 moving violations. So she called me in a panic. She said, what should I do? I said, go to court, but take your contract. So she did. And when her case came up, the charges were read off, and she handed the judge, with fear and trembling, the document that had been signed. And he said, thank you very much, miss. Case dismissed, next. She said, I couldn't believe it. It was just like that. I said, well, that's good. She called me a week later again, because what the civil courts did was they contacted the base commander where this guy was serving. He'd been up for a promotion to corporal and had planned a nice cushy billet to audition for the band in Washington, D.C. and have, that was how he would play out his military career, playing music. Never saw combat, But they busted him back to private third class. They garnished his pay to pay the fines, and they made him actually spend time in the military jail. And so after she hung up from that call, I definitely did kind of a happy dance around the apartment. Now, in reflecting back on that, what I am astonished by is that, number one, I was only 21 when I thought this up. This is what I mean by old and, sort of sage before your time. But also, I did this thing all behind the scenes, like Matus, crafting armor for her daughter. At
That's
no
great.
time did I come into the picture. You know, I was not part of the main story. I was just the script writer.
She's probably thankful to have such a good friend with good advice.
She was, eventually she broke up with him, thank heavens. But that's my Athena story, being strategic.
Yeah, having a
Sometimes,
well laid plan.
yes. One of the things my father-in-law used to always say was, read the rule book. Once you know the rules, you can figure out exactly how you work with them to force change.
Right, exactly. That's a wonderful story. And thank you for the wonderful presentation.
The one piece of advice that's sort of poetic that I'd leave people with, in addition to, okay, how do you channel your inner Athena here, or inner Metis, Athena's mother? Um, this huge mass of seemingly conflicting energies all gathering around the Aries point. I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about the upcoming ingress of Saturn and then Neptune into Aries. One of the most wonderful metaphors for Saturn and Neptune that I can think of that exists in the physical world is glass. Glass is a miraculous substance. It can be exceedingly fragile, and it can be made tremendously strong through, inclusion of different minerals and stuff into the structure. But the magical thing about glass, which is melted sand, is that it isn't a solid. It has no internal crystalline structure. It is a liquid masquerading as a solid. So you have Neptune fluidity and Saturnian form that are united in this strange marriage. We are fortunate enough. The reason I love the Pacific Northwest here, especially Washington, is we have our very own Hephaestus, Dale Chihuly, a glass artisan, who has, if you look at his works, they look very organic. They look like live sea anemones, or, urchins, or all kinds of strange flowers and plants and everything. It's astonishing what he and the stellium of students and, acolytes and other artisans that sprang from him. I had no idea that we would have a god of glass when we got up here.
Yeah, there's a lot of glass blowers in the Northwest. It's amazing.
So it's sort of the phenomenon of glass and creating glass suggests that what can you create in your own life that is both beautiful, Venusian, phenomenally strong, potentially, Saturn, and fluid.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about.
Yeah. And in each person's life, I've got to believe it will take different forms depending on where that conjunction falls in their chart, what other planets might, aspect it, what the particular signs are in their Venus star point.
Well, prepare for what you think is going to happen, but be flexible enough to flow and make the changes as necessary.
Yeah. Here is another sort of like a story, because I have natal Saturn at 2 Libra. So that star point, even though I have my own personal head of my star is Scorpio, okay, Aries is definitely still there in the whole picture. And now that the star point has come around to conjoin natal Saturn, maybe I have a chance to do some interesting stuff too.
Well, maybe
Because,
there's some shifts and changes that you're not even anticipating at
yeah,
this moment that will come into being in the next few months.
for instance, we need some service on our solar panels on the roof. So my husband had been trying to get in touch with the company who you did the service and maintenance, and was having bad luck. And I sort of went, I think I will look this company up. A bit of online research. proved that they had gone bankrupt
Oh
last
no.
November. So we are now seeking a new, provider for the service on our solar panel array. But the idea popped into my head: I should look these people up. Are they even still around? Because especially since the pandemic, businesses have been hugely impacted, all over the place, and not everybody recovered, or some kind of made a comeback and then went under later, and such like that. So just the idea popped into my head: I should look this up and find this out. So this conjunction, the Cazimi, took place in my eighth house of joint resources.
Ah, very good. The conjunction for me is in my 10th house, and um, I'm got some new projects that I'm working on, and kind of excited to bring them in. I'm going to do a relationship show, and then for the spring equinox, I had two guests on at the same time, and that was a new thing for me. So, and it went quite well. I was very happy how it went. I didn't really know how it would go, but I enjoyed it, and so little by little, things are changing, and that's a good thing.
Yeah,
So, thank you for this wonderful, wonderful presentation. Lots of information for all of us. And I want to thank those that are watching live and those that come back and watch at a later time. And we have one more slide for your resources.
yes.
So, do you want to tell us about those?
Yeah, Bernadette Brady is the author of Brady's Book of Fixed Stars and Star and Planet Combinations. So that was where I went for a mythic source for those little star charts that I showed you. Um, Adam Gainsbourg, in addition to Ariel Gutman, who wrote Venus Star Rising, he wrote The Light of Venus, in which he deals with all of the phases of a cycle. He treats the Venus cycle as starting from retrograde conjunction to retrograde conjunction, and has all of the different phases mapped out. It's a very interesting book all on its own if you want to evaluate your own natal Venus in regard to the phases. Like, he's written, like Dane Rudhyar's, the lunation cycle. Gainsbourg wrote the equivalent of the lunation cycle for the Venus cycle.
Yes, I attended one of his workshops, and it was really good. And if people are interested, they could probably find um, that they can purchase a copy of that to listen to it, because it was very fascinating.
Yeah. And then finally, the two classical sources that I keep turning to frequently are Demetra George. Um, I was using mainly Volume 1 of Ancient Astrology for researching for this talk, but also the Charles Obert book I mentioned previously, Using Dignities in Astrology. Um, Demetra is very much rooted in Hellenistic, Charles Obert more in medieval Renaissance.
But that's a really good combination of all the sources.
Okay.
Well, thank you again. And other upcoming shows I have with Astrology Star Sisters are Chinese astrology, decans using astrology and tarot, dwarf planets, fixed stars, planet stationing, Uranian astrology, and the Venus star point from time to time.
Uh-huh.
And then there's still a couple more 2025 astrological highlight shows coming, and a new show, Cosmic Connections, with relationship astrology and magical astrology. And Justin and I do the astrology forecast and full moon forecast each month, and a Chiron asteroid series from time to time. I will be on Talk Cosmos on March 30th at 1 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, talking about the Aries solar eclipse new moon. And then again, to get a hold of Marcia, it's Madam M at mindspring.com. And my website is alightpath.com. And Marcia, you had mentioned earlier about if people wanted to know what their Venus star points are, that they could email you. Is that
Yes,
correct?
yes, that is.
Okay. Okay, so if you want to know your Venus star points, just send Marcia an email, or if you send it to me, I will forward it to Marcia. And again, thank you so much, Marcia,
Well, you're
for
welcome.
joining me today. This was wonderful. So we're going to say goodbye for now, and we'll see you next time.
You bet.